For years, the moon was the ultimate symbol of human ambition, a silent white witness hanging above the planet like an invitation that could no longer be ignored. It dominated headlines, justified massive budgets, and stood at the center of the greatest technological race in history. Every broadcast, every countdown, every grainy transmission reinforced the same message. Humanity was reaching outward, and the moon was the first step. Then something changed. Not gradually, not naturally. After one specific event, the conversation simply stopped. NASA didn't announce an end. There was no dramatic explanation, no closing ceremony for an era that had defined a generation. The moon just quietly disappeared from the center of attention, as if someone had turned down the volume on a subject that had become too loud. Officially, the reasons were practical. Funding was redirected. Political priorities shifted. New missions focused on low Earth orbit, space stations, reusable vehicles, and eventually distant planets. On paper, it all made sense. The moon had been visited, samples had been collected, flags had been planted. The story, according to the public narrative, was complete. But that explanation begins to unravel the moment you look closely at the timing, the documents, and the subtle changes in language that followed the final Apollo-era operations. The last crews returned home to parades and applause, yet internally, something had shifted. References to the lunar surface in NASA's technical communications became increasingly vague. High-resolution imaging initiatives that had been proposed with enthusiasm were postponed, then quietly removed from public planning documents. Proposals to revisit specific regions were approved internally, assigned preliminary budgets, and then never moved beyond the paper stage. Not cancelled, just left to expire in silence. What stands out most is not what was said, but what was not. Questions surrounding specific Apollo transmissions were met with delays. Audio archives were partially released, with key segments missing or labeled as corrupted. Engineers who requested raw data encountered unexpected barriers, told that certain files were incomplete, misfiled, or temporarily unavailable. Technical reports from the period began using unusual language, referring to unexpected variables and non-repeatable conditions without further clarification. These phrases appeared briefly, then vanished from all subsequent documentation, as if they had been scrubbed not only from the record but from institutional memory itself. From the outside, it looked like closure. The moon was framed as conquered, understood, no longer urgent. Public interest shifted to Mars, to telescopes peering into deep space, to theoretical futures that felt safely distant. But buried in declassified material and contractor testimonies, a different pattern emerges. Certain lunar coordinates continued to appear in classified appendices, long after public interest faded. Entire surface regions were quietly deprioritized, despite advancements in imaging technology that should have made them easier to study than ever before. Former engineers and analysts, speaking years later and often anonymously, suggested that the issue was not mechanical failure or environmental risk. According to them, the data itself became the problem. Signal behavior that didn't match natural interference, timing anomalies that couldn't be reproduced in simulations, observations that suggested reaction rather than randomness. Nothing dramatic enough to confirm, nothing simple enough to dismiss. To understand why silence became the preferred response, you have to return to the moment when the moon stopped being just a destination and started becoming a variable. During the later Apollo missions, equipment had improved. Sensors were more sensitive. Communication systems were refined. Crews were staying longer, traveling farther from their landing. Sites interacting with the environment in ways that earlier missions never attempted. With that increased presence came increased data, and with data came patterns that no one had planned for. Some mission logs describe brief interruptions in telemetry that didn't correspond with known lunar phenomena. These interruptions were short, sometimes only fractions of a second, but they occurred at moments that raised questions. During surface operations, during equipment deployment, during routine checks that should have been entirely predictable. The interruptions didn't cause mission failures. They didn't endanger crews. They simply existed, unexplained and persistent enough to be noticed. In internal discussions, these anomalies were initially treated as technical quirks, New technology always reveals unforeseen complications, but when analysts tried to isolate the cause, the answers became less satisfying. The anomalies didn't align with solar activity. They didn't match known patterns of cosmic radiation. They didn't behave like equipment malfunctions. In some cases, they appeared to respond to astronaut movement or changes in local activity, as if the environment itself was interacting with the systems in a way that had not been anticipated. This is where the language shifts. Reports stop describing malfunctions and start referencing conditions. Not failures, but circumstances. Not errors, but variables. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one. A malfunction implies something broken. A variable implies something active, something that can change. Around the same time, requests for more detailed lunar mapping increased behind the scenes. Certain regions became the focus of internal curiosity, not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconsistent. Reflectivity readings didn't match surface composition models. Temperature fluctuations behaved oddly during lunar night cycles. Seismic data hinted at structures or densities that were difficult to reconcile with existing theories of lunar formation. None of this was conclusive. None of it was enough to justify a public announcement, but collectively, it created a problem that NASA had not faced before. The moon was supposed to be inert, predictable, a dead world that could be understood through physics and geology alone. Instead, it was beginning to behave like a system that responded to observation. At first, the solution was to gather more data, but gathering more data meant sending more missions, deploying more equipment, and asking more questions. And questions in this case carried risk. Not the kind of risk measured in budgets or hardware, but in narrative control. The space program was not just a scientific endeavor, it was a cultural symbol. Admitting uncertainty about the moon after presenting it as understood would have undermined decades of messaging. So the strategy shifted. Instead of denial, there was silence. Instead of explanation, omission. The fastest way to make a mystery disappear is not to argue against it, but to stop acknowledging it entirely. Over time, the moon became familiar again in public discourse, reduced to a symbol rather than a subject of investigation. It was there, visible every night, comforting in its constancy, no longer framed as a frontier that demanded attention. But silence leaves traces. In budget allocations, in redacted pages, in the careers of scientists who quietly transitioned to other fields. Some lunar specialists found their projects indefinitely delayed. Others were reassigned to Earth-focused research or deep space initiatives. Officially, it was a natural evolution of priorities. Unofficially, it looked like a dispersal of expertise away from a problem that no one wanted to articulate. Years later, when portions of NASA's archives were declassified, researchers noticed something odd. The gaps were not random. Entire categories of lunar data were missing, while surrounding information remained intact. It was as if someone had gone through the archives with a specific list, removing not everything, but just enough to prevent a complete picture from forming. Contractors who worked on Apollo-era systems have hinted at meetings that felt different from typical technical briefings, conversations that ended abruptly, questions that were acknowledged but never answered. One former communications engineer described a moment when a superior told him, "This isn't something we're going to solve by looking harder." The implication was clear. The solution was not more investigation but less visibility. As decades passed, new generations grew up with a version of space history that felt complete. The moon landings were a triumph, a closed chapter. Mars became the new dream. Telescopes replaced footprints. The idea of returning to the moon was occasionally mentioned, then postponed again. Each delay was justified with logic. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. But, taken together, they formed a pattern of avoidance that became harder to ignore. Even today, NASA maintains that the moon holds no unresolved questions of strategic urgency, no anomalies worth revisiting, no mysteries that demand immediate attention. And yet, modern technology could answer many of the questions left open by Apollo with relative ease. Autonomous probes, advanced imaging, continuous monitoring. The tools exist. The capability is there. What's missing is the momentum. Some speculate that whatever happened during that final chapter was not a single dramatic event, but an accumulation of small, unsettling discoveries. Not a revelation, but a realization. The moon, it seemed, was not just a rock in orbit. It was something more complex, more interactive, more resistant to being neatly categorized. And complexity is dangerous when your entire narrative depends on certainty. There are those who argue that the silence was an act of caution rather than concealment. That, without clear answers, it was better to step back than to speculate publicly. That the moon could wait, that understanding would come later with better tools and more context. But waiting has a way of becoming permanent, especially when the questions challenge assumptions that have become foundational. The most unsettling possibility is not that something extraordinary was found, but that something ordinary behaved in an extraordinary way. That the moon, through its subtle interactions and unexplained responses, exposed limits in our models of reality. Limits that could not be easily communicated without unraveling more than just a space program. Consider the way certain lunar regions were quietly labeled as low priority. Not dangerous, not forbidden, just uninteresting according to public documentation. Yet those same regions appear repeatedly in classified appendices, in mission simulations that were never flown, in sensor calibration tests that referenced specific coordinates. Without explanation, it's as if the moon had places that were both important and unmentionable. Former analysts have suggested that some of the data hinted at feedback mechanisms, signals that changed based on observation conditions, measurements that drifted when monitored continuously, but stabilized when ignored. These are subtle effects, easy to dismiss individually, but troubling when they form patterns. Patterns that suggest the act of measurement itself was influencing the outcome in ways that classical physics struggles to explain. If that were the case, the implications would be profound. Not evidence of intelligence or intent, but of systems that operate at scales and principles we do not fully understand. Systems that blur the line between passive object and active participant. Systems that challenge the assumption that space is simply an empty stage on which events unfold. Faced with such implications, silence becomes not just a strategy, but a shield. By redirecting attention, by framing the moon as solved, NASA could continue its broader mission without opening a conversation that had no clear end. The public, eager for new horizons, followed willingly. Mars, exoplanets, black holes. The universe is vast, and there is always somewhere else to look, and yet the moon remains. Close, familiar, unavoidably present. Every night it reflects sunlight back to Earth, unchanged in appearance, untroubled by the questions it quietly generated. It is a reminder of how much can be hidden in plain sight, how silence can be more telling than any declaration. In recent years, renewed interest in lunar exploration has emerged, driven by international partnerships and commercial ventures. Plans are announced, timelines are proposed, but even now certain topics remain conspicuously absent from public discussion. High-resolution, continuous monitoring of specific regions is still deferred. Detailed analysis of older Apollo data remains incomplete. The language is careful, controlled, devoid of curiosity about the very anomalies that once caused concern. This raises a question that has never been fully addressed. What happened during that final chapter that made the safest response not clarification, but silence? Was it a discovery that challenged existing science, or simply the realization that some questions, once asked, cannot be easily unasked? Did NASA step back because it found something, or because it realized how little it truly understood? The absence itself has become the mystery, not a crash, not a cover-up in the dramatic sense, but a gradual retreat from a subject that refused to behave as expected. The moon did not explode with secrets. It whispered inconsistencies, enough to be unsettling, not enough to be conclusive. And in a system built on confidence and control, whispers can be more dangerous than shouts. As we stand on the edge of a new era of space exploration, with technology far beyond anything available during Apollo, the silence surrounding the moon feels increasingly deliberate. We have the tools to look again, to listen more carefully, to ask better questions. The only thing missing is the willingness to reopen a conversation that was quietly closed decades ago. Perhaps the moon is exactly what we think it is, a barren world shaped by impacts and time, holding no secrets beyond its geological history. Or perhaps it is something stranger, not in the sense of aliens or artifacts, but in the way it interacts with observation, measurement, and expectation. A reminder that the universe does not always conform to our narratives, no matter how carefully they are constructed. What we know for certain is that after one specific period, the conversation changed. The moon went from being the focus of humanity's outward gaze to a background presence, acknowledged but not examined. And that shift, subtle and undocumented, may be one of the most revealing events in the history of space exploration. Because in science, unanswered questions are not unusual, but unanswered questions that are no longer asked are something else entirely. They suggest a boundary, not of distance, but of understanding. A line that was approached, glimpsed, and then quietly stepped back from. The moon still hangs above us, unchanged, waiting, and the silence surrounding it continues to ask a question that no official statement has ever resolved. Why did we stop talking about the one place we knew best, just as our ability to understand it was finally beginning to mature?